saints and there were sinners. There were violent people and there were peaceful people. I want to read to you one of my favorite poems by Joy Harjo, who's a member of the Muscogee Nation and lives in Oklahoma. She was the first Native American chosen to be Poet Laureate of the United States. Her words linger. This is called Remember. This is a day about remembering and about living in the present moment. Her words are about remembering. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life, of your mother's life, and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life who all have their tribes, their families, their histories. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember you are all people and all people are you. Remember you are this universe and this universe is you. Remember all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember language comes from this. Remember the dance that language is, that life is. Remember. We are not the only nation in the world with an indigenous population. There are estimated to be 5,000 different groups of indigenous peoples around the world. There is an International Day of Indigenous Peoples, which is celebrated on August 9th, which I always think of because it's my daughter's birthday. In this country, we celebrate it on this the second Monday in October, which traditionally was you know what. Once upon a time it was October 12th and it was you know what. Yes. And as time went by and we became better educated about the history of this country, the settling of this country by foreigners, we came to understand a lot more about you know who. I say you know who because I've done a lot of reading about his life and about his expeditions. And because in theological school we had to study what happened in the, quote, New World when you know who came. Nowadays, if people celebrate you know who day, I hope they're doing it out of respect for Italian heritage, not because of what happened when he was here. He came to the West on 4 different expeditions, and some of those expeditions resulted in furious violence against the indigenous people who were already here. It's interesting, you may have grown up with this thinking that the world was flat back then, because we were told that everyone thought it was flat and that when he went west, oh, it's round. But that's not true. Greeks knew that the world was round Hundreds of thousands of people knew that the world was round. That story about you-know-who going west, no, that's a myth. That is a myth. Maps existed, spheres were created, people knew the earth was round. His mission, he said, was to find a route to India, to China, to the east by going west. And of course, that didn't work out, did it? Because suddenly he bumped into islands and then a landmass, the north coast of South America, which he realized was not an island. It's surprising that he realized that, but he did. He knew it was a gigantic landmass. And he was just the tip of the spear, wasn't he? He was just one of many you-know-whos who left Europe and moved west. The term indigenous is used to refer to, I'm going to read a quote here. It's used to refer to the earliest known inhabitants of an area and their descendants, especially one that has been colonized by a now dominant group of settlers. Settlers, settlement, settling on your place, on your homestead, on your tribal lands, on your fishing territory. Yes, outsiders who come in. But the term lacks a single authoritative definition and can be used to describe a variety of peoples and cultures. In its modern context, the term indigenous was first used by Europeans who used it to differentiate the indigenous peoples of the Americas from the European settlers of the Americas. I'm guessing, just going out on a limb here, that everybody here is descended from Europeans. Am I right? Mm-hmm. Mostly from Europeans? Is anybody here indigenous? No. Being born here doesn't make you indigenous. You have to be related to the past, the very, very far past. It's thought, and of course this information has changed as anthropologists and archaeologists have gotten more and more thorough, that the first people to come into the North American continent as it then existed, 30,000 years ago, came across that land bridge from Asia into the northern part of what became known as North America. Mitochondrial examination, DNA tracing and all the rest of this shows the similarities between people of certain tribes and people of the land bridge expedition. We know that it took thousands of years for those people to move down the western part of North America, to spread east, ultimately south, and to then move down through Central America into South America. And guess what happened? The you-know-whos arrived. They came from their home countries looking for space, looking for resources, looking for gold in particular, looking for something they could claim for another country, another territory. And isn't it interesting that all those you-know-whos, our ancestors, came here, and most of them settled in geographic areas that looked like the ones they had left behind. Isn't it amazing that Scandinavians go to the Midwest and up to the north, and Latin ancestors go to the south where it's warm and tropical? Isn't it amazing? Everything is recreated all over again. And of course, in the midst of all these depredations, people had to be moved away, did they not? We all know about, I believe we do, we all know about the Trail of Tears, do we not? The evacuation of the Native Americans from the eastern United States, especially in North Carolina, Tennessee, those areas, launched by Andrew Jackson, another you-know-who, and moved forcibly to the west. If you go to the movies in October, November, you may see Killers of the Flower Moon. Have any of you read that book by David Grant? It's horrifying. It is a horrifying story about Native Americans who moved onto reservation lands in Oklahoma Killers of the Flower Moon. And then when oil was discovered under the ground, guess what? The European settlers in that area wanted to steal that land back from the Native Americans. They had forced onto that land that looked like it was worth nothing. And what did they do? Some of them proceeded to marry members of the tribe and then kill them so that they could inherit their rights to the oil below the surface. This is not a fictional story. This is a real story. It's like the attack in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Oklahoma has a long, bloody history. The attack on the Greenwood section of Tulsa. The African American community, which was thriving and doing well, and the jealousy of the European population that went in and burned it down. Right? Killers of the Flower Moon. The Flower Moon, you may not know, is the name of the full moon in June. It's called the Flower Moon. The book and the film are about this, and Martin Scorsese has made the film. And honestly, I don't know if I can go see it. I was so upset reading the book, I don't know if I could stand seeing a dramatic interpretation of that. The things they did were absolutely unacceptable, immoral, violent, dangerous, burning down homes, setting fires, setting traps for people, giving them diseases. This is just one example of many, many different attempts by settlers to take something that is not theirs. Is it any wonder that there were Indian wars in this country? No. Wouldn't you? If someone gave you a blanket infected with smallpox, wouldn't you get angry? Wouldn't you be angry if someone deliberately infected you with COVID? Just think about that. We don't know what's happening with COVID in Native American communities in this country. It would be interesting to know. We do know, because sociologists have studied the survival of indigenous peoples, that they have suffered far more greatly from alcoholism, from extreme poverty, from illnesses like tuberculosis in particular, from smallpox, of course, which wiped out hundreds of thousands of people in the Western Hemisphere, all brought by people from the other side. And certainly that didn't stop people from kidnapping indigenous peoples here and taking them to Europe as slaves in the 1500s. There were people doing this. We don't hear about that. We hear largely about the African American cargo exchange of people being captured in Africa, bought in Africa, brought to the West and sold into slavery here. But we don't hear much about the other direction, when Native Americans were kidnapped and sent, hundreds of them. One ship went across, going to Spain or Portugal, with about 500 people on it, and the ship sank, and 200 survived. The rest all drowned in the ship, but we don't know much about that. I encourage you to go on the internet and look up these things. Look up the histories of indigenous peoples and the various crimes they've had to deal with. Look up what this country has done. We know this, the practice. I don't think there's a single treaty that's been honored in this country. Is that what you have heard? You know this? We have not honored, this government has not honored the treaties it has made with Native American people. There's a wonderful movie that's been on television recently called Woman Walks Ahead. Have you seen this with Jessica Chastain? She plays an artist who goes to the West to see Sitting Bull and others to paint their portraits. And you see in that film what happens when the cavalry gets involved. You've probably seen Dances with Wolves, yes? Mm-hmm. Yes, famous for its scenes of the cavalry moving in and eliminating those who are, quote, in the way. We have a terrible history with this. So what can we do with it now? Now we can recognize it, we can acknowledge it. If you feel like donating money, you can give it to the American Indian College Fund, which I do now every year, because when I talked about this several years ago, someone said, here's what I do. And so now I've started donating money to them. I also adopted a number of children through Save the Children from Arizona, from the Diné Nation, which is something my family did for 30 years. And a Catholic priest who was a great friend of my mother's was sent to South America because he was gay. He was forced out of the United States into South America, and he found that a lot of the Andean Indians in the territory where he was stationed would leave their children on his doorstep. They were too poor to support their families, and so they gave them to him. When he came back to the United States, he adopted 12 of them. And he launched a house called the House of the Rising Sun, which he set up in Massachusetts. And he called me one day and said, "Julie, I want you to come up here. I want to introduce you to someone." And so I went, and he introduced me to a young girl he had named after me, whose name was Julia. And I said, "I want to know if you will agree to be her sponsor in the event of my death." You won't be surprised to know what my answer was. I said yes. Of course I said yes. My husband was horrified, but I was not. I was so honored that he had done that, and I'd known him for years. He was in a psychiatric hospital with my mother for a long time. And he came to my ordination at St. John the Divine as the one Catholic representative in my family. And yeah, he told me a lot about my mother that I have never known. And I was just so touched by his care of those children. They've all grown up, they're all adults. He closed the house, he retired, and then he passed away. His name was Jack Branch. He and my mother were the only two people in their psychiatric unit who did not kill themselves. Wow. Everyone else they were with in the hospital they lived in all those years died. It's a terrible thing. But Jack made an enormous impression on me. His sympathy for children and his care of the trouble he went to bring 12 children out of South America and set them up and be their father was really amazing. More of us can do these things in small ways, maybe not in great ways, but in small ways. The indigenous peoples of the world are still suffering. There are many countries that won't even acknowledge that they have indigenous peoples. Vietnam refused to acknowledge it. Cambodia refused to acknowledge it. Japan refused to acknowledge it, but Japan has two very distinct indigenous populations. The Ainu on the island of Hokkaido in the north, and the Okinawans on the south island of Okinawa. They are not ethnically Japanese in the sense that the Japanese consider themselves Japanese. No. One group very light-skinned, one group very dark-skinned. We know that Russia says that it has no indigenous people. That's a lie. There are two groups in Siberia who are considered indigenous people. Mongolia has indigenous people. African countries have indigenous peoples. They are subsets of people who live in areas that were invaded by others who wanted to settle in their territory. Just think of the Dutch. I hate to say this, my ancestors. The Dutch who moved into South Africa and launched the Boer War. Boer is the Dutch word for farmer, fighting for territory there. And think of what happened with apartheid in the Dutch word, with the settlers separating out the indigenous population. We know in this country that this has happened all across the territory of the United States, all across. It's also happened in Canada, although we tend to think the Canadians are very friendly, all shucks, hey people. The First Nations people would argue against that. They too were forced into schools, the way Native American children were forced into schools in different places. I support another Native American school too. Yeah, we have to stop that, don't we? Don't we have to think about what happens when we ignore the fact, and this is a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, God is unity and works in variety. There is a reason that the world's populations are diverse, just as its flora and fauna are diverse. Because we need that. We need that in order to survive, biologically speaking. When populations are wiped out, we lose not only their culture, their language, their customs, their way of dress, their skills. They have all kinds of skills that we know nothing about. And yet you may recall how they were demonized as savages, as primitive people. Yes. Has anyone ever told you you were savage? That you were primitive? That you were a wild person? Well, back in the 70s, yeah. The truth is coming out now. I want you to consider this on Indigenous Peoples Day. And next August 9th, when it's World Indigenous Peoples Day, we can think about it again. Our 8 principles speak directly to all of these issues, do they not? Mm-hmm. Affirming and promoting the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, the search for the good community, yes. Respect for religious practices of earth-based religions and peoples, all of them, they all speak to this. And if we live those values, we are better positioned to understand what goes on with the others. The others. May it be so.